Right, so this is our ongoing discussion of Simondon's individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're starting from page 235 of the translation, and we're in part 2 of the book on vital individuation. So we saw last time Simondon's criticism of the notion of adaptation, especially in relation to the work of Kurt Lewin, who was a Gestalt psychologist, if I'm not mistaken, worked in the US, but was originally German. So Lewin's theory of action is based around this notion of field of force. So action would be structured in response to forces in the environment. So the situation of an organism or of a person in particular, it would be structured in relation to certain elements of the environment as goals of action, and other elements would be obstacles. And then so the goal would have an attractive force, and the obstacle would have a repulsive force, or some sort of blocking force in the environment. Simondon's criticism of this account has to do with the way that, as he argues, this account sort of presupposes what it's supposed to explain. So the coherence of the environment, or the fact that the environment makes up a whole in which the organism appears, is presupposed by this theory. So rather than giving an explanation of what it means for an organism to have an environment and to be oriented towards different aspects of the environment, the theory presupposes the existence of this total environment and the compatibility of the different elements of that environment. And so what Simondon wants to present as an alternative to this theory is an account of action in which the possibility of action doesn't precede the action itself. So there's nothing like a pre-existing structured environment in which the action appears. So he uses this notion of a path. So that there isn't something like a path through the environment that pre-exists the action. Rather, the action is an event of individuation of the environment and the organism at the same time, so that this path appears together with the action. And so there's a transformation of the subject and of the environment at the same time, that they both undergo this individuation process. Then the last little bit that we left off with is, so Simondon argues that that Lewin's theory, this field theory, is operating with a notion of stable equilibrium rather than metastable equilibrium. And so in a stable equilibrium, there's no more possibility of transformation of the system. All the potentials have been used, and the system is at its lowest energy state. Whereas in a state of metastable equilibrium, the system is in equilibrium temporarily, but it retains the potential to undergo further transformations and to perform work. So it retains that potential energy. And so for Simondon, action has to be understood as related to a system in a state of metastable equilibrium rather than stable equilibrium, because the action is a transformation, and so the potential energy has to be present in the system for that action to occur. Okay, so that's where we left off, and I'll pick up from the bottom of page 235 for those who are following along. Okay. To account for the activity of the living, we must replace the notion of stable equilibrium with that of metastable equilibrium, and we must replace the notion of good form with that of information. The system in which the being acts as a universe of metastability, the preliminary disparation between the perceptive worlds, becomes a condition of structure and operation in the state of metastable equilibrium. The living being is what maintains, transposes, prolongs, and sustains this metastable equilibrium through its activity. The complete universe only exists so long as the living being enters into the axiomatic of this universe. If the living being is removed or disengaged, the universe breaks down into perceptive worlds of new disparates. The living being, which enters among these perceptive worlds to transform them into a universe, amplifies the singularity that it bears. Perceptive worlds and the living being individuate together into a universe of becoming. Only this universe of vital becoming can be grasped as a veritable total system, but it is not given all at once. It is the meaning of life, not its condition or origin. Goldstein has indeed indicated the meaning of this systematics on the whole, but by treating it as an organismic unity, he has been forced to a certain extent to take it as a principle and not as a meaning, whence the Parmenidean aspect of his conception of being. The whole is given at the origin, such that the vital becoming is difficult to grasp as an effective dimension of this systematics. The structure of the organism would be understood better at the level of perceptive worlds in Goldstein's theory than at the level of activity, properly speaking. Holistic dominance is at the beginning, such that totality is the totality of the living being, rather than the totality of the universe, including the living being inserted through activity into the perceptive worlds that have taken on a meaning for the becoming of this activity. Sensory systems are difficult to think in their relative distinction. However, the structural and functional distinction of the senses is the basis for action, insofar as they are a basis for the significations residing in the pairs of forms that are the only ones starting from which information can exist. Sensibility, the plurality of sensations, therefore cannot be unified under a global function, since this plurality is the foundation for future significations as a plurality of points of contact, based on which significations will be possible during the course of further individuations. So this is a fairly dense passage, but let's try to go through sort of in order and see what we can get out of it. So the first bit is on metastable equilibrium, as I mentioned in the introduction. So in accounting for the activity of the living, so the capacity that living beings have to perform actions in the proper sense of the word, we have to use the notion of metastable equilibrium, as I mentioned, and then the second thing we have to do, or the second replacement that we have to carry out, is that we have to replace the notion of good form with that of information. So good form here is the notion drawn from Gestalt theory, according to which perception would be a kind of seeking of equilibrium, so that a form like a square or a circle or other sort of simple forms would be an equilibrium state of perception, and then more complicated forms or less good forms, forms that don't have this property of being good forms, those forms would be states of tension or states of disequilibrium, and there would be a tendency towards the equilibrium, so that the complex forms or the forms that don't have this property of being good forms would always tend towards the good form as their sort of resting point. And Simondon has, I think we've seen this already in a previous passage, he criticizes this notion precisely because it's a notion of equilibrium. So the good form on this account would be something that is a state of equilibrium, and thus there would be no possibility for further transformations on the basis of a good form. And so he argues instead that we have to use the notion of information. And so here, this notion of information is one of his key notions, and there are a few different meanings that he uses. He uses the term in a few different ways, but here he's thinking, as far as I can tell, he's thinking of what he sometimes calls primary information, or he'll sometimes describe it just as information, but in contrast to information signal. So here, information means the capacity for a system to undergo structuration. So in accounting for the activity of the living being, we have to use this notion of information. So we have to understand the living being as something that is capable of undergoing structuration, rather than as something that seeks a good form in the sense of a stable equilibrium. So the next bit here is about so he uses this term universe, and in this passage of the book here, in this section, he makes a contrast between universe and worlds. So he describes perceptual worlds, so each sense modality would have its own worlds, and there would be different worlds for in relation to different behaviors of the organism. So he a little bit earlier he talks about there would be a world in relation to prey, a world in relation to a sexual partner, a world in relation to food, predator, etc. So all the different aspects of the environment that an organism can respond to in its behavior, each of those aspects would constitute a distinct world. So there's a world for each aspect. But then the universe is a unification of multiple worlds. In perception, when we perceive an object, we're unifying multiple different sensory worlds. So there's a disparation of those worlds in the way that they're initially given. So we have different responses to a possible object, whether it's a fear response and running away from it, or grabbing it, or eating it, or whatever other possible responses. So each of those responses forms its world. But then when we perceive the object as such, we are uniting those disparate worlds, and so that's what the universe is. So it's insofar as a living being unifies different perceptual worlds in its relation to an object, that's the universe. So as he sets it out here, the universe is sort of coordinate with the living being. So it's only in relation with a living being that there is something like a universe, perceptual worlds, which are related to the living being's behavior. And then so this universe, what he describes as this universe of vital becoming, so this universe as something that undergoes the process of individuation, is the only aspect that is so Simondon is presenting this notion of the universe as the unification of multiple perceptual worlds. The universe is a whole or a totality, but as he specifies it here, it's not all given at once. So it's not like there's a universe which is sort of present, and then everything would sort of derive from that universe in a straightforward way. What instead is happening is the universe is undergoing individuation together with the organism as well. So rather than having something like the universe being given all at once, the universe is given through its history or through its process of individuation over time, over the course of this process of Genesis. In that sense, it's not given all at once, and this is his criticism of Goldstein, is that he argues that Goldstein takes this universe to be given all at once at the beginning of a process of development or of behavior, and then everything that follows is just a sort of consequence of this principle that is set out at the beginning. This universe as the totality or as a whole. It's only the following forms of behavior. So in this account, the actions of an organism are just all sort of derived from the structure of the universe in which the organism appears, and there's nothing like the way that there's this appearance of a new dimension in Simondon's account, as we've talked about in previous weeks, where the two disparate retinal images are unified through the invention or discovery of a third dimension. Nothing like that can happen on Goldstein's account.
Oh, as you said, just quite intense, the part, just 2 paragraphs, but it says lots of things, and then particularly for me, I'm really happy to get to know like Goldstein theory, in addition to Gestalt theory, even though like Gestalt theory mentioned last week, and like Parmenidean like a philosophy. I think except for me, everyone knows like Parmenides. I don't know how to pronounce properly, like the philosopher pre-Plato. So these all like open my eyes like in a different way, cause like particular Goldstein theory, and then Parmenides, and then Gestalt theory. These are all kind of like the basis of the Simondon's theory, right? So basically, Simongdong, this idea based on these pre-existing ideas, and then he the difference between him and then Goldstein's theory. That's kind of point I think we should think about. Even though sorry, how can I call your name non manifest? How can I call your name non or non manifest or manifest?
Any of those are all fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, you explained like brilliantly like the kind of possible distinctions among the theory from Goldstein's theory. But for me myself, I think I need to like think of more. And then going back to the information, always like it. I was struggling with to clarify the meaning of information in Simongdong's theory, along with the concept, the notion of event. And then here, really clearly defined that information is a system in which the being acts is a universe of metastability. As non-manifest, as you said, this information for Simongdong is kind of different from like information we were using as a word. So it's kind of more like a organization, a system, a kind of like some kind of frame, which makes possible which makes it possible for a human being, like individual, to experience like a transformation. So it's like a frame, right? Like it's not. So normally, like information is like the content, like which stimulates a person to act or to think or something like that. But here, it's much more like the form.
Yes, I think that's right. So he does always relate the notion of information to the notion of form, and we can see that in the actual structure of the word information. Like the word form is part of it. So information, the sort of literal meaning is of a form being imposed on something or something having a certain form. But the way Simondong uses the term, he wants to distinguish his usage of the term from the notion of information in the theory of communication or the theory of the mathematical theory of information. In information theory, you look at information with relation to a signal transmission. So you have a emitter on one end of a radio emitter or one end of a cable or whatever system you have that transmits information. So you have an emitter, and then you have a receiver on the other end. The sort of big picture is that the emitter can be in a certain number of states. If your source of information is, say, flipping a coin, you have two states. And then you want to transmit the information about what state the coin is in to the receiver. So that means your channel has to have at least two states in order to be able to transmit the information of the state of the coin. And so there's a certain minimum capacity that a channel has to have in order to be able to transmit information about the state of the source. But the sort of downside of this account of information for Simondon is that it only accounts for or explains the transmission of information, but not the actual generation of the information in the first place. So how is it that you have some sort of structure that is that can be transmitted in the first place? So why is it not the case that the situation is unstructured or lacking in information that can be transmitted? So in another text, which is an annex to this book, which if we get to the second volume, we can read, is called Form Information Potentials. So in that text, he gives a sort of example of this when he says that if you if you take a bucket of sand and dump it on a desk, and then you take a picture of that pile of sand on the desk and you want to transmit it, the location of every grain of sand on that desk is a huge amount of information. So transmitting that picture requires a very high fidelity or high definition image to be able to locate each grain of sand in its position on the desk. But then, on the other hand, if you want to transmit an image of a square, all you have to do is say the square is so many centimeters wide and it's so many centimeters away from the edge of the screen. You just have to transmit maybe 3 pieces of information that specify the location and the size of the square, and then the person on the other end can reproduce the square exactly as it appears on your side. So the pile of sand on the desk is completely unstructured, but it contains a lot more information in the sense of information transmission than the case of the square that you're trying to transmit, which contains a very small amount of information in terms of transmission. And this is it seems sort of a paradoxical concept, like this completely unstructured mass of sand piled on a table is in a sort of intuitive sense, we would think that it has less information, it conveys less information than something structured like a square. And so Simondon wants to have an account of the way that the square has a higher what he calls a tension of information, or this alternate notion of information in which the square would have a higher qualitative value of information than the pile of sand. And the way he wants to explain that higher tension of information is that the square has the capacity to structure something that is previously unstructured. So the receiver, the person on the receiving end, when they receive the square, their perceptual situation becomes structured in a way that when they perceive the pile of sand, it doesn't. There's no structuring of the perceptual situation in that case. This notion of information, as Simondon uses it, has to do with the capacity to perform structuration. So something has a high tension of information to the extent that it is capable of bringing about the structuring of a domain that is previously unstructured. And here we can think of the crystal example that he uses over and over again. So the germ crystal brings about the structuration of the whole solution in its crystallization, and so the information of the contained in that germ is amplified and structures the whole domain. And some process along those lines is what we should think of when he uses the term information. So we should always think of some sort of germ or a singularity which is amplified so that it structures a whole domain.
Yeah, quite interesting. About your explanation, like I think like you brought like the example from the another part of his book in order to explain that is not the fixed form. I think Simondon proposed that kind of example, but that lacks in a way like I think a spatiality. Well, spatiality, should I say that kind of way? It's not a matter of like just the frame versus like in terms of information. That's not the just like a thing of frame. What I understood from your explanation is like information here is like form plus meta, which has intersubjective points of views. So in the case of the sands, that can be seen when it's like sprinkled on the table, like in the kind of a square frame. It can be seen. It can be seen in a different way. Like here, like for the sand itself, it could perceive its positionality in itself, and then like as an observer, we also think it's something different, something like that. So point here is that that may be a good example, but at the same time, it lacks some kind of points, I think. And then I think information here is kind of the system. System maybe like it includes the meaning of like it's not just this is the form or frame. It's more than that, which it has like variables which makes possible an agent to like to keep transforming itself. What about that?
Yeah, that capacity for transformation is definitely built into his concept of information. It always has to do with information in the specific sense that he uses the term is always relative to a capacity for transformation. So it's only because the receiver of a message is capable of undergoing a transformation that they can actually receive information in the standard sense of the word, so in the sense of communication. And so the sense of the word that he wants to, the sense of information in the way that he wants to use the word should always be understood in conjunction with the capacity for transformation. So it's the capacity for something unstructured to become structured. And so that's how we can sort of define information in Simondon's vocabulary.
Yeah. And also thank you for pointing out that also has to do with information theory, which is I'm a receiver. I mean that kind of like a diagram I can think of, like something is coming in, something that comes in, and then something comes out. You are talking about that kind of thing, like as an information theory, and that also the part of help like me to form the idea of the information.
Yeah, so his notion of information is different from the information theoretical one. So the one that is used by information theory, but he wants to sort of base his theory on the theory of information and extend it to not just the signal that's transmitted, but to the capacity for generating information that can be transmitted in the first place. So the generation of structure before transmission. Yeah, that's one of the key notions of the book. This notion of information. I mean, it appears right in the title. So we'll keep sort of coming back to it as we go through the book. So here, in relation to a living being, he wants to use the notion of information to account for the living being's capacity to perform actions. And so an action is a sort of structuring of the whole system that includes the organism and its environment. And so information here has the role of bringing about the structuring of that whole system. So there's this disparation of the different perceptual worlds is the sort of initial state, and then there's the appearance of the universe as the unification of these disparate worlds, and this unification is a process of individuation, which brings about a structuring of what was previously unstructured, and so it has this character of information because of that.
Yes, actually, I also ask and then talk about. I mean, want to get some ideas from you, about the Goldstein theory. But we can go further, and then maybe we can come back like the Goldstein theory, something like that.
Yeah, I don't really know Goldstein except for what Simondon says about him. I won't be able to answer a lot of questions about that, but I can help to explain what Simondon is doing with Goldstein, but I don't know Goldstein's work sort of directly.
Actually, the book you shared a little bit different aspect of Goldstein theory. I just quickly I searched the link, and then you can download the paper. of the guy, like I don't know whose name. But anyways, this person, golden theory. I mean, very interesting word from the paper is that self-actualization. If that is true, I think really Simondong is based on like golden theory. I mean, kind of a big influence, I think, in a way. I mean, really quick research on Google tells me like golden theory maybe like has to do with some kind of language or linguistics something. But the idea of self-actualization and then the conditions of it, and then that's quite interesting. And then maybe yeah, I might read more and then make some kind of share some ideas maybe next time.
Yeah, that would be great. Because as I said, I the only other bit on Goldstein that I know is via Merleau-Ponty, who cites Goldstein and at certain points, and so I think one of the sort of key notions that Goldstein or key arguments that Goldstein makes is that when you're looking at the behavior of people that have suffered neurological damage of some kind, there are, depending on what type of damage you have to your brain, there are certain types of action that you aren't able to perform anymore, or you can't perceive things in a certain way anymore. But Goldstein argues that in understanding the behavior of a person that has suffered neurological damage, you can't just sort of subtract the function. You can't just say that they're similar to a person without this injury, and then but just minus the certain capacity to perform a certain type of action or whatever it is. You have to look at the whole structure of behavior, and the actual behavior that results is a sort of effort of accommodation on the part of the person who has the injury. So there's it's not just the behavior of that person is not just the behavior of someone without an injury and then minus certain capacities, but it's an actual restructuring of the whole system of behavior in a way that allows them to sort of work around their the injury and the inability to perform certain behaviors. They develop strategies to work around these obstacles, and so this notion of the whole system of behavior, or this totality of behavior, I think is the notion that Simondon is working with. He sort of takes up from Goldstein, but also criticizes the way Goldstein makes use of it, and he wants to develop it in a different direction.
Mm-hmm. Right. What you just said is like there's no default. Like there is no given form of a behavior. It's quite interesting. Like you mentioned that like reconstructing the behaviors. That's not minus the thingy. So something like wow, this is restructuring. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I know that, I mean, it's something that I have looked at a little bit, but not a lot. But like, the types of, there are different types of neurological injuries, and depending on what area of the brain or of your nervous system is injured, you have different types of deficiency that appear. But there's definitely a tendency for neuroscientists and people studying these types of brain injuries to sort of assume that you can just like subtract the behavior. You can just say that the person with the injury is just like they were before the injury, except without behavior A, B, and C, or something like that. And so having a better idea of the relationship between different behaviors and the whole structure and the way that structure changes after an injury, I think is probably necessary to have a better account of the behavior of people after the brain injury. So we've been on these 2 paragraphs that we read a while ago. So we've just been sort of working through some of these ideas because they're very dense paragraphs. But I do think we should try to move on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read, starting from subsection 3, we can go through like a page or so and then discuss that.
Yep. If you is there anybody who wants to read? Like, otherwise I can read. Can do.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Oh, are you going to do it right now or?
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Then I'll do first, and then. All right. Please just stop me somewhere. It's
Sure,
wrong paragraph. Limits of individuation 3. Limits of individuation of the living. Central characteristic of the being. Nature of the collective. So the theory does not suppose that all vital functions merge together and are identical, but tends to designate all these functions by the operation of individuation that they carry out. Thus, individuation would be a much more general and widespread operation than what is usually considered as an individuation. The fact that the living being is a separate individual in the majority of species is nothing but a consequence of the operation of individuation. Ontogenesis is an individuation, but it is not the only individuation that is carried out in the living being, or that takes the living being as a basis and incorporates it. To live consists in being agent, milieu, an element of individuation. Perceptive, active, and adaptive behaviors are aspects of the fundamental and perpetuated operation of individuation that constitutes life. According to such a conception, in order to think the living being, life must be thought as a transductive result of operation, self-individuation, or, better yet, as an interlinking of successive resolutions, insofar as each previous resolution can be taken back up and reincorporated in subsequent resolutions. In this sense, we could consider that life in its entirety seems like a progressive construction of increasingly elaborate forms, i.e., for example, forms capable of containing increasingly elevated problems. The vital axiomatic is complicated and enriched through evolution. Evolution is not a perfecting, properly speaking, but an integration, the maintenance of metastability that increasingly settles on itself and thereby accumulates potentials, assembles the structures and functions. Individuation as a generative of perishable individuals submitted to aging and to death is only one of the aspects of this generalizing Newtonizing vital individuation that incorporates an increasingly rich axiomatic. In fact, the individual as a limited being submitted to the here and now and the precariousness of its isolated condition expresses the fact that it remains something unsolved in the vital problematic. It is because life is the resolution of problems that remains something residual, a detritus that cannot take on signification, a remainder after all the operations of individuation. What remains in the old being is what has been unable to integrate it, and the unassimilated, from the aperion before individuation to the something aperion afterlife, from the undermined of the before to the undetermined of the after, from the first dust to the last dust. An operation is carried out that does not break down into dust. Life is in its present, in its resolution, not in its remainder. And death exists for the living being in two senses that do not coincide. It's a hostile death, that of the rupture of the metastable equilibrium, which is only maintained through its own functioning and its capacity of ongoing resolution. This death construes the very precariousness of individuation. It's a confrontation with the conditions of the world, the fact that it is engaged and takes risks and cannot always succeed. Life is like a posed problem that may not be resolved and may be resolved badly. The axiomatic class is in the very course of the resolution of the problem, a certain risk or happenstance from outside therefore exists in every life. The individual is not self-enclosed, and there is no destiny contained in it. For what it resolves is simultaneously the world and itself, the system of the world and itself.
That's fine to stop there, because the next paragraph is a long one as well. So yeah, let's stop there. So there's a lot in this this long paragraph here. So here we the last few subsections, or the last bit that we've been reading, we've looked at the sort of biology of individuation, so the different forms of individuation that appear in different living organisms, and we just had a bit on the psychology of individuation, or the relation between individuation and behavior. But now we're turning to more strictly philosophical reflections on individuation. So here, we're still talking about the individuation of living beings, but at a very abstract level. Life for Simondon has to do always with resolving problems. So we should always think of that example of the two retinal images as an example of a problem. The problem is resolved by invention, by the appearance of this new third dimension of depth in visual perception. But we should take that as a model for other living problem solving. So life as a whole consists in solving problems through something like an invention of a new dimension. In relation to individuation, there's also there are these two notions of death, or two different ways in which death appears in relation to an individuated being, and so we've only seen the first one so far, and we'll see the second one in the next paragraph. But the first one is so the first notion of death is the notion of death insofar as it has to do with the ongoing process of individuation and the failures of resolution of problems. So insofar as a living being is just solving problems, some of those problem solving operations will fail, or some of those problems will be solved badly, and so death is just sort of the result of this failure to solve those problems in an adequate way. So this notion of death is a sort of external notion of death, insofar as it has to do with the problems that are presented to an organism by its environment, so it's insofar as an organism is not capable of solving those problems that it dies, or that it's subject to death. But we'll see another notion of death in the next paragraph as well.
I think this part is like, particularly toward the end of the chapter, is great. I mean, the individual is not self-included, there is no destiny contained in it, for what it withdraws simultaneously the world and itself, the system of the world itself. What I understood from this line is that Simondon, I mean, I didn't read the next part, but maybe like it just reminded me of the collective individuation. So what really interested me was from the Simondon's introduction. I mean, I forgot the author, the American guy. I can't remember the name. But then the point is that the death is not the death. I mean, the end, and then it can be shared. People who live. I mean, and then it just can, as far as can be regenerated on people's memory or in other form. Maybe this idea is linked to the collective individuation.
Yes, we when we get to that part on collective individuation, we'll see that he does talk about something like what remains after death of a person, and so he cites Spinoza. Spinoza has this wonderful line about how we sense and we experience that we are eternal, so Simondon says that this is right. We do have this eternal aspect to us insofar as we can be sort of incorporated into the ongoing individuation process of other people, through collective individuation, as you pointed to. So there's something of the individual that survives death, insofar as they're sort of kept alive in a way by the other people that surround them, and so there's a close relationship between the understanding of death in the individual and collective individuation. Okay, we can go on to the next paragraph and the next notion of death if someone else would like to read a paragraph. So we're starting from the bottom of 237 here. But death also exists for the individual in another sense. The individual is not pure interiority. It is burdened with the weight of the residues of its operations. It is passive by itself. It is to itself its own exteriority. Its activity weighs it down, charges it with an unusable determination, an indetermination in stable equilibrium whose nature is exhausted, deprived of potentials, and can no longer be the basis for new individuations. The individual little by little takes on elements of stable equilibrium that charge it and prevent it from going toward new individuations. The entropy of the individuated system increases throughout the successive operations of individuation, particularly in those that are not constructive. The results of the past that lack potential accumulate without becoming the seeds for new individuations. This heatless dust and this unenergized accumulation are the rise of passive death within the being, a death which does not originate from confronting the world, but from the convergence of internal transformations. It can nevertheless be wondered if aging is not the counterpart of ontogenesis. Tissues that are cultivated in vitro and transplanted frequently enough to never yield large masses live indefinitely. It is generally said that these tissues owe their unlimited longevity to the fact that transplantation prevents the accumulation of toxic waste products within the ensemble of the living matter. But it can also be noted that transplantation always maintains the portion of living tissue in a state of undifferentiated growth. As soon as the portion is large enough, it differentiates, and the differentiated tissues die after a certain period of time. However, differentiation is a structuration and a functional specialization. It is the resolution of a problem, whereas the undifferentiated growth of frequently transplanted tissues takes place before any individuation on the level of the portion. Perpetual transplantation always brings the tissue back to the same point in its evolution as an ensemble that can be the support of an individuation. The tissue's longevity is no doubt due to this absence of individuation. There is an iteration of the growth process, an externally provoked iteration. The fact that a large enough ensemble differentiates and dies seems to show that every differentiation leaves behind a certain residue that cannot be eliminated and places a burden on the individual, thereby diminishing the chances for future individuations. Aging is indeed this lesser capacity of renewal, as studies of the healing of wounds show. The individual that is structured and specializes its organs or its automatic habitual frameworks becomes increasingly less capable of recreating new structures if the old ones are destroyed. It's as though the majority of the initial potentials proceed by diminishing and the inertia of the being proceeded by increasing. The being's viscosity increases through the effects of individuating maturation. This increase in inertia, rigidity, and viscosity is apparently compensated by the increasingly pronounced richness of the acquired arrangements, i.e. of adaptation. But adaptation is precarious in the sense that if the milieu is modified, new problems may not be resolved. Then the previously elaborated structures and functions will encourage an unhelpful iteration. In this sense, the fact that the individual is not eternal seems like something that should not be considered accidental. Life in its entirety can be considered a transductive series. Death as the final event is nothing but the consummation of a process of amortization that is contemporary with each vital individuation, insofar as they are operations of individuation. Every operation of individuation deposits death in the individuated being, which is therefore progressively charged with something it cannot eliminate. This amortization is different from the degradation of the organs. It is essential to the activity of individuation. The being's inborn indetermination is little by little replaced by the indetermination of the past, deprived of tension, a pure inert charge. The being goes from the plurality of initial potentials to the indistinct and homogeneous unity of ultimate dissolution across successive structurations of metastable equilibria. Individuated structures and functions make the two indeterminations between which life is inserted communicate. So again, we have a long paragraph with a lot in it, but this is the second notion of death. Oh, hi, Angus. So we have the first notion of death was the one in the previous paragraph where you have death through the incapacity to solve problems and the failure to solve problems that are posed by the environment. Here, the second sense of death is an internal sense of death. Death in this sense is something that arises through the way that the organism is no longer capable of undergoing further individuation. So the potentials that it has at the start of its life have been exhausted, and the organism is no longer capable of undergoing further transformation. And so this is here we can think of death through old age. He specifically mentions aging as the process through which an organism loses its capacity to undergo differentiation and to undergo individuation, and this capacity for renewal or for self-transformation is lost over time, so that the individual ends up being incapable of undergoing further transformation, and so that's what death in this sense consists in, is the sort of buildup of inertia, or this depletion of the capacity to undergo further transformation. Yeah, there's something we can you can take a look at that after we're done here today. But there's one of the footnotes in this paragraph. He just brings up the example of in the case of a tree, the tree is capable of when it's a young tree, the tree is capable of restructuring its growth so that if say one of the large branches of the tree is broken off, the tree will restructure its growth to rebalance around the trunk. So other branches will change their direction of growth so that the tree remains balanced. Whereas an older tree is still capable of it's still alive. It still grows new leaves and performs all the functions of life, but it's no longer capable of that restructuration of growth, so that if one of its branches is broken off, it will just persist in a unbalanced state. So yeah, we have the same. We have an aging process in the case of trees, just like in the case of animals. Okay, so let's go on to the next paragraph on 239. If someone would like to read from If the Individual.
If the individual has meaning, it is certainly not just in terms of the being's tendency to persevere in its being. The individual being is transductive, not substantial, and the being's tendency to persevere in its being seeks the equivalence of a substantialization, even if the individual is only composed of modes. In fact, the meaning of the living being cannot be found in its unconditional integration into the species. The species is a reality that is as abstract as the individual would be if it were taken as substance. Between the substantialization of the individual being and its absorption in the superior continuum of the species, wherein it is like the leaves of a tree, according to the expression that Schopenhauer has taken up from Homer, the race of man is related to that of leaves. There is possibility of grasping the individual insofar as it is limited as one of the sides of essential vital individuation. The individual is a transductive reality. Through the span of its active existence in the temporal dimension, it increases life's capacity to solve problems. The individual bears an axiomatic, or rather a dimension of the vital axiomatic, the evolution of individuation, this binding of a functional structuration and of an amortization paired together and constituting each active and perceptive operation transforms the individual into a being that translates potential which are incompatible with one another into a metastable equilibria that can be maintained by means of successive inventions. Like any transductive series, the individual's existence must be grasped within its milieu in order to be comprehended in its full reality. The complete individual is not merely the being that goes from its birth to its death. It is essentially the being of maturity, with the status of existence that is between two extremes, and that gives meaning to the two extremes. Birth and death, and then ontogenesis and destruction, which are anabolic processes and catabolic processes, are extremes relative to the center of maturity. The real individual is the mature individual, the median individual. The individual continues in maturity not by, again, becoming eternally young or transmutating beyond an ultimate death. The individual corresponds to its function most fully in its center of existence via these individuations that resolve the world and resolve the individuated being. Young and old, the individuated being is isolated, mature. It is structured in the world and structures the world within it. The structures and functions of the mature individual link it back to the world and insert it into becoming. Significations are not like individuated beings. They are not contained or enclosed in an individual circumference that would degrade only realized significations. The paired structures and functions of the mature individual surpass the here and now of the individuated being, the mature individual, the one that resolves perceptive worlds into action, is also the one that participates in the collective and creates it. The collective exists as the individuation of the charges of nature transported by individuals. What accumulates this translation of the structures and functions elaborated by the individuated being is not just the species as a phylum, but also the collective unity of the being. It could be said that a second birth in which the individual participates is that of the collective which incorporates the individual itself and constitutes the amplification of the schema that it bears. The individual is translated into the collective as an effectuated signification, as a resolved problem. And information, it is therefore prolonged across and above, but not in its individuated enclosure. With respect to its discovered signification, the individual is itself in the here and now, a progressive amortization, a detritus, and it incrementally detaches from the movement of life. The individual is neither complete nor substantial. The individual has no meaning except an individuation, and through individuation which deposits it and stores it as much as it assumes it by way of participation. Individuation does not merely occur in the individual, and for it occurs around it and above it. The individual is translated through its center of existence, converted into signification, perpetuated in information, whether implicit or explicit, vital or cultural, thereby waiting on successive individuals to reach maturity and resume the signs of information left behind by their predecessors. The individual encounters life in its maturity. Entropy is not merely internal or personal, it is individuation in accordance with a collective. Lucretius represents living beings as relay runners. The pass on torches, this is no doubt how he understands the flame of life given at birth. But this can also be understood as what is passed on to the interior of the collective recreated and renewed through time by its successive individuals. I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, you can stop here. Yeah, the paragraph goes on for another page, 2.5 pages. So yeah, we can stop here for sure. Thank you.
Am I too slow?
No, it's good. It's just that this is an extremely long paragraph. So here we're talking about the relationship between the individual. So what sort of meaning the individual has in relation to death. And so he points to Schopenhauer here. And I don't really know Schopenhauer very well, but I know that Schopenhauer has this notion that the species is in some sense more fundamental than the individual, so that in death the individual disappears, whereas the species remains through reproduction. So the species is what persists through time, whereas the individual disappears. And Simondon wants to, so he sets out sort of two different extremes, and he wants to find a position between those extremes. So the one hand would be, on the one hand would be the substantialization of the individual being, so treating the individual as a substance that persists through time, and the individuation of the individual being would be its identity through time. So on the one hand, this substantialization, and then on the other hand, this notion of Schopenhauer that would absorb the individual into the species. And so the species would be what is substantial and that remains through time, whereas the individual is just disappears in death. And so Simondon wants to find something that is sort of intermediate between these two notions. And so he describes it as a possibility of grasping the individual insofar as it is limited as one of the sides of essential vital individuation. Individuation is sort of intermediate between the vital individual itself and its absorption into the species, in the sense that the the process of individuation includes both the individual and something that is not individual. So in the process of individuation, you have both the organism as well as its milieu, which does not undergo individuation, or which has not been individuated. And we have to understand. So for Simondon, we have to understand the dispersal or the fanning out through time of the individual. So the fact that an individual is born and then has a youth and then maturity and then old age and then death. The fact that the individual is spread out through time, we have to understand this as a transductive series. So there's a sort of structuring, a temporal structuring of the individual's lifespan. And we have to understand, we have to grasp that transductive series through its middle point or from its middle point. And so that's in the case of the living individual, that's maturity. So the mature individual is it's not just sort of one stage in the process of individuation or in this transductive series. The mature individual is the complete individual. It's the individual in which the capacities are at their greatest, so that the individual is itself to the greatest extent in that mature stage. So it's insofar as an individual is mature, it has its greatest degree of reality. So the young, the juvenile form or the old form of the individual is in some sense isolated from the world. It no longer either it doesn't yet have the capacity to act on the world. In the young form, it doesn't have the capacity to act on the world yet, and in the old form, it no longer has the capacity to act on the world. But in the case of the mature organism or the mature stage of the lifespan of the individual, it has its greatest capacity to act on the world. So it exists in a structured world in the sense that it's a world that presents itself to the organism as being capable of being acted upon. So that's the sense here of this passage. The structures and functions of the mature individual link it back to the world and insert it into becoming. So the mature individual is the one who is capable of grasping potentialities of the world and acting on them. So transforming the world in a certain way.
I think this part really stresses the potential and then the capacity of the transformation, not only of an individual but also its environment, so milieu, at the same time. And then I think that Simondon really wants to extend an individual's life and then things to the collective level. So in that sense, the death of an individual is not the end. It's coming up again, like with the interconnection with the another individuation of another individual, such and such. And then in a way, like the previous part, where the which L read the. But in terms of actually, it hasn't really little to do with difference repetition. But in a way, what I got from difference repetition of Deleuze, the repetition it's not the repetition. It always like creates difference, and then it makes something go on. I mean, singularity, particularity, multiplicity, and so on. So here, an individual in his or her lifespan, the singularity and particularity can be generated, and it can be passed on, and it can also influence its milieu, and then everything can go on like with those metabolism or mechanism, whatever. So the point, what I understood from these two part, is so the meaning of death. I mean, what Simondon wants to emphasize is from the discussion about death. So as not the determination of the life, but it's a kind of part of a collective reality, something like that, and it's part of like a collective potential.
Yeah. There's definitely, as we discussed a little bit earlier, there's definitely a relationship between death and collective individuation, insofar as collective individuation allows for something like survival beyond death. But here he wants to look at, so he does mention this collective individuation as a kind of second birth, as he puts it here. So the living organism, through its participation in the collective, has a sort of second birth, and so it sort of persists at the stage of youth or maturity. But he also here wants to look at the structure of life, the lifespan, and in particular, he wants to emphasize the way that the notion of maturity, or the stage of maturity, I should say. The stage of maturity is the fullest realization of an individual in over the course of its lifespan, and so it's only because an individual has this. It's only because an individual can reach that stage of maturity that it can realize the maximum of its potentials. So at the stage of maturity, the organism is capable of the greatest action, the greatest transformation of its environment. And so maturity is sort of the central point of life. And so when we understand the individual, we should understand that individual as a mature individual. That's the sort of key moment of an individual's lifespan. And so he also wants to set out this grasping of the individual in its maturity. He wants to contrast this with Schopenhauer's conception, where the individual is just sort of absorbed into the species, and the actual the particularity of the individual is sort of meaningless for Schopenhauer. And so for Simondon, when we want to think about the meaning of life, or the capacity for a life to be meaningful, we have to think of the stage of maturity as the stage in which a living being has the greatest capacity to perform actions.
So I meant to ask a question about maturity. The word actually you were explained and quite helpful. And then kind of like a silly question. Like, then each individual can get to their maturity. But here maturity means like you said the point. Somebody can how do I say it, like the perform like his or her potential in full extent, but the maybe like a lot of people can do it or not do it. I mean, do not do it, right? Like it's not something general, right? Like in reality.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it seems like it should be possible on Simono's account. It should be possible for someone to never reach maturity. You can sort of stay in a juvenile state if you never actually exercise your capacity to perform action. So you are always sort of stuck in a juvenile state, and you never actually reach maturity. I think that is something that Simono would think makes sense. So in that sense, yeah, not everyone necessarily reaches a stage of maturity in their lifespan, and it could be relatively rare as well. It could be something that only a small number of people actually achieve maturity in the full sense of the term.
Actually, regarding that issue, like it was a silly question, but in a way, like it inspired me to think another one, like a couple of lines up there. For example, like what accumulates this translation of the structures and the functions elaborated by the individuated being is not just the species as a phylum, but also the collective unity of a being, something like that. So in a way, like immature people could make a poisonous influence, like a bad influence on their milieus, and then Sibong's theory like gave me some idea of positive idea, like optimistic idea. Maybe perhaps like human beings, the potential should be emphasized, and then you can go forward to something optimistic. But reading this part makes me think that maybe some people contribute to negative influence, so-called negative influence. Of course, we should define what negative influence, but by doing that, bad history repeats again. I mean, things like that. I mean, that the human history goes like something optimistic, like kind of like make a balance, like at the end of the day, like a 0 point going towards 0 point, that the something better, but the something neutral. I mean, plus minus 0, something like that.
Yeah, I think. So yeah, there are a few different things in your comment. So the idea that because our maturity is in some way related to collective individuation, that we could have something like that other people or ourselves could have something like a negative influence on other people's maturity, so that you could undergo a collective individuation with another person in such a way that you become less mature, or at least you are sort of prevented from becoming more mature. So that seems plausible too. I think that makes sense, that collective individuation shouldn't be understood as something like essentially positive or necessarily positive. It's possible to have a collective individuation that that has a negative impact on the individual that is incorporated into that collective. So maturity, with respect to maturity, you could have something like a group of friends who sort of hold each other back with respect to maturity. They sort of bring out the worst in each other, and they don't allow each other to become more mature. That seems like something that probably happens in real life. So then the other bit in your comments was about optimism and in connection with Simondon's account of the human lifespan, and I think I think his account of the human lifespan is an optimistic one in certain respects, in the sense that he wants to find something like meaning or meaningfulness to life in relation to maturity, and also in the way that he, as we'll see later on, how he takes the individual to be to have something eternal about them that survives beyond their death through their participation in collective individuation. So that side we can describe as being optimistic, I think, pretty straightforwardly. But there's also what could be considered pessimistic, or at least less optimistic, in the sense that he, as we saw just a couple paragraphs ago, about how death is a sort of internal product of individuation, so that the living being brings about its own death through its individuation. So life itself brings about its own death, and so there's this, I guess, negative, or maybe not negative, but there's a certain finitude to individuation, in the sense that it's always, in the case of living individuation at least, it's always bringing about its own death in the process of individuation. So life consists of nothing but individuation, but then in that individuation, it's also bringing about its own death. So there's a certain inescapability of death, even though, on the other hand, we have this eternal aspect. We at the same time are also we can't escape death through this this eternal aspect. We're still mortal beings.
Yeah, just like the Nazism, like people who collaborated with Nazis, that could be like a negative point of collectivity, maybe. And then I just quickly looked at the next part. Maybe we are going to read and discuss next part, and then it seems to have more talk about maturity. So here, maturity itself is not the just positive, but it could be negative at the same time. Like it's quite interesting.
The Nazi Party would be an instance of collective individuation that has a profoundly negative sense, so that you have a collective individuation that's dedicated to death rather than to something like life, or to a new creation or something along those lines. So yeah, that's sort of what I was pointing to when I mentioned that we shouldn't think of collective individuation as something that is necessarily positive, or that has an essential positivity to it. There's also this capacity for collective individuation in the service of death and in the service of negativity. So we're pretty much at time. So I don't think we should go on to the next bit of the paragraph. So we'll start from. So maybe one last bit is just what Ollie has posted in the chat here about Lucretius before we go. So that so for Lucretius, Lucretius talks about well, he's an Epicurean, and so he's sort of devoted to depicting death as something that is not an obstacle to living a good life. And so there's the famous argument that where death is, I am not, and where I am, death is not. So we shouldn't be concerned about death because when we're dead, we just won't exist. So there's nothing to worry about. Simondon will look at the way that Lucretius talks about life as or the relationship between generations as a relay race. So there's a torch of life or a flame of life that's passed from one generation to the next, and each one picks up the torch and carries at a certain distance, and then passes it on to the next generation. So we'll talk about that metaphor next time, and how Simondon wants to interpret it, and how it fits in with his account of the span of life. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. I was a little bit worried at the beginning that we might not have anyone show up, but I'm glad that we had at least a few people today. Thanks for your contributions, and see you all next week.